At release, DICE's Mirror's Edge left much of the video game press stumped. This game was undoubtedly fantastic, but something about the experience was preventing reviewers at the time from regarding Mirror's Edge as a top-flight product. While Metacritic rating isn't always a particularly useful source for a sense of a game's reception, an 81 in 2009 is a good representation of the audience's lukewarm reaction to Mirror's Edge. When brutal legend is outperforming you, there's clearly something wrong. However, Mirror's Edge has gained a healthy, appreciative audience that has changed modern perception of the game. The newfound positivity has reached cult status, and, having never played it, my curiosity regarding Mirror's Edge was piqued. The concept of Mirror's Edge is likely the most interesting thing about the game. Spurred by the impressive acrobatics within the opening of 2006's Casino Royale, Mirror's Edge sought to capture the fluidity of parkour and deliver an authentic experience to those who may have lacked the athleticism to partake in the sport themselves. Faith's movements across the rooftops are meticulously crafted to be as reflective of the parkour experience as possible, and the game's level design is constructed in such a way as to give the impression of a real location while also operating as an effective jungle gym for the player to platform through. Parkour's emphasis on viewing an environment and finding one's own original path through it was an element of the sport that DICE were clearly aware of during development of Mirror's Edge. But whether they were successful in effectively representing this element is up for debate. The game is successful at implementing many of the most recognizable movement strategies. Vaulting, wall running, and rolling are actions the player must actively engage in order to progress through most of the levels. It's a very deliberate method of control that puts the player much closer to the proverbial ground. On PC, Mirror's Edge has a few control quirks that impacted my experience somewhat. Much like reality, Faith cannot begin sprinting from a stand, and must run a short way to build momentum. This is genuinely excellent, and forces the player to actively search for a location where they can gain some speed before throwing themselves across a gap. In tighter environments, it can be difficult to find somewhere to get this run up, but these levels generally don't demand speed. The jump feels good, but the context-sensitive commands are often stubborn, so getting Faith to wall run seems inconsistent. Similarly, missing the context command when vaulting or mantling obstacles at speed will cause Faith to jump toward the object but not engage the movement. She then stops and momentum must be regained. Had more lenient context commands been implemented, that flow state that is integral to parkour could have been better accommodated. The first-person perspective does a lot to hinder that too, surprisingly. Spatial awareness is something people are inherently accustomed to within their everyday lives, so having to adapt to Faith's physicality is a little awkward. Faith will reach for some obstacles that gave me a better point of reference for the location in the space, but it was uncommon enough that I never permanently ingrained that sense, and the things that Faith refused to reach for were occasionally quite frustrating. Leaping across streets and grabbing onto a vertical pipe is a regular occurrence within most levels, and while this is a fantastic spectacle, if the player isn't perfectly lined up, Faith will not grab the pipe and will instead fall to her death. Sometimes I was falling to the street while the pipe was within arm's reach, and Faith still wouldn't grab it. If you aren't perfectly lined up to the front of the pipe, you die. It is fortunate that these problems are exceptions and not the rule, because the majority of Mirror's Edge levels are masterfully assembled. There has been careful consideration placed into how each player might view the layout ahead of them, and often there will be numerous routes through the wider chunks of levels. The player does need to head for the goal location, and this will rightfully put them onto more restricted paths, but nobody complains about only having one way into their front door. Highlighting objects in red to draw attention to them is a solid idea, but it certainly reeks of a failure to give the player a better understanding of their environment. It isn't a mechanic designed to get the player looking for a genuine opportunity to gain momentum or enter a flow state. It trains them to look for red stuff and jump onto it. But sometimes these hints are necessary. After Faith climbs out of the sewers and begins scaling a nearby scaffold, a helicopter appears and begins shooting at her. The player must quickly ascend the scaffold and reach the big red crane at the top, but the path up the scaffold involves doubling back a few times, which isn't immediately clear. The game becomes a trial and error test of which direction is the correct way, and which way results in death by helicopter turret. This location would have been greatly assisted by adding a few more red markers to suggest climbing upward. DICE managed to get themselves into a catch-22 scenario, in which placing too many red markers spoils the illusion of freedom, but having too few risks the player getting lost. DICE is a rather strange company, whose current position as the vehicle for Electronic Arts' unsavory business strategies was unexpectedly not their origin. Although, prior to their acquisition, DICE wasn't exactly a bastion of artistic creativity. Their first handful of games were mainly pinball games, which means DICE did have to create a fairly robust physics engine to get the games to work, but at the end of the day, it's digital pinball. DICE were then contracted by Volvo in 1997 to create a promotional video game for their F40 model, which would result in DICE gaining licenses to the Swedish Touring Car Championship, the Race of Champions event, and NASCAR. DICE would continue to develop licensed games until 2000, when the developer acquired Refraction Games. Refraction had developed a fairly comprehensive first-person shooter set during the First World War, and were deep into production of another shooter. Battlefield 1942 was what Refraction had been developing, and DICE chose to continue pursuing the project. It was a massive success, and DICE quickly pivoted their entire development team over to producing expansions and sequels within the Battlefield series. Road to Rome, Secret Weapons, Vietnam 2, Special Forces, Modern Combat, 2142, Bad Company, Heroes, 1943, Bad Company 2, Online, 3, 4, 1, 5, and the currently unreleased 2042. The series has been a constant presence since 2002 and doesn't appear to be slowing down anytime soon. With that gigantic pile of Battlefield content, DICE would occasionally stray away and tinker with some racing game franchises before canning them and eventually trying something new. Mirror's Edge would be released in 2008, after DICE had gained considerable first-person shooter experience. Strange, then, that after the numerous other first-person shooters DICE has developed, Mirror's Edge's shooting mechanics are so mediocre. The tutorial teaches the player how to disarm enemies and to use their guns against them. So while the shooting is not a system the player always has access to, they are incentivized to take advantage of weapons whenever they can. Not a single firearm within Mirror's Edge gives the sensation that it is an object designed to kill a person. The sound effects lack any kind of punch. The shotgun sounds like someone slapping the top of a glass, and the high-powered rifle, capable of destroying the engine block of an armored police vehicle, sounds like somebody closing a car door.
Looking good. Route is clear. What's happening? Report, over.
And the shooting visual effects are very underwhelming, especially when put alongside Bad Company, which released in the same year. And the damage numbers are all out of whack. Faith doesn't scoop up any extra ammunition whenever she steals a gun from an enemy, so there's no reloading. This means the guns have to come loaded with enough shots to kill at least one enemy, but sometimes a lot more. Something like a standard pistol only has a handful of shots, but all of those shots will need to be lodged into an enemy's ribcage in order to take them down. Meanwhile, this automatic rifle downs enemies with only a couple of bullets. Combat is not something that seems to have been a high priority within the development of Mirror's Edge. but there are a few different enemy types, a boss battle, and selectable difficulties. Most of the enemies are regular police officers that mainly act as obstacles to avoid, or a timer to get the player moving quickly. Their rate of fire is often comically low, and standing near enough to them will force them to swing at Faith, providing an opportunity to disarm them. Eventually, the game introduces an enemy type that will actively chase after the player, although their capabilities are very limited. The chaser enemies are also not especially dangerous, and they're prone to getting in each other's way, causing them to push each other off of ledges. The boss enemy is probably the most bizarre inclusion within Mirror's Edge, as they are capable of blocking incoming attacks, but only the second attack. And so long as the player continually strafes around the enemy, they cannot hit Faith. I think the helicopter attacks, while a very extreme response to take, are a far more successful means to get the player moving quickly, as well as create a puzzle encounter to try and destroy. The humanoid boss doesn't serve the narrative very well, so entirely removing it wouldn't have been too disastrous. As for what the different selectable difficulties do, changing the game to easy will make the enemies shoot even slower, and changing it to hard will make them shoot faster, as well as remove the red hints from the entire game. Why bother? At release, reviewers criticized the narrative of Mirror's Edge for being mindless, which is not the word I would use to describe the plot. Incoherent is the word I would use. Faith's employment as a runner, a parkour mail service, somehow relates to the potential dilution of the authoritarian regime that currently keeps the city strictly idealistic. The people must kind of adhere to the rules, although they can participate in the democracy and are allowed to run against the authoritarian leaders, but they may be subject to potential assassination attempts. The city's law enforcement departments had only been making token attempts to stop the runners from delivering their packages, but for whatever reason, Faith's suspected involvement in the assassination of the opposition candidate not only inspired the police force to engage in more aggressive tactics, but it was also deemed necessary to hire a private military to try and kill one person. Faith's sister is dangled above her for some kind of motivation to run around the city. Meanwhile, every other character Faith meets is either killed or is revealed to be working for the government in some way. There are clearly enough means for the government to eliminate Faith as a threat to their authoritarianism, but they just prance around the possibility of resolving the issue. And if you thought that was difficult to follow, the scenes of the characters occasionally discussing the plot are the only constant that keeps the plot moving forward, so the half-hour-long levels mainly serve as a diversion from whatever the narrative is attempting to talk about. Mirror's Edge was always going to be about style, from the laser focus on delivering an accurate parkour experience, to the game's blinding palette, to the game's idea of conveying a coherent narrative to the player. DICE's priority with this game was to be seen looking cool. Faith is an outsider to the prevailing culture throughout the city she lives in, moving through the world in her own way. She's drawn to the colorful, stimulating things that she can find, and spends a lot of time moving between stimulus. But the world keeps trying to force her back into line, so desperately that everyone she knows is either put into great peril because of her actions, or are actively conspiring against her to enact that enforcement. That could have been the plot. The free bird refuses to be caged, instead of some nonsense murder mystery that serves no benefit to the main gameplay activities. Mirror's Edge played without acknowledging the narrative, and stopping at the halfway point would be a tremendous experience. But I don't think that it's worth $30. So, provisionally, the answer to the question, is Mirror's Edge worth playing today, is a yes, unless you don't already own the game. The spectacle is absolutely satisfying, and there's a competently designed movement system in here that is worth learning. The number of first-person platforming games has increased over the last decade, and a bunch of those games are interesting enough to warrant forming an understanding of where they came from. But all of the reasons for Mirror's Edge's poor reception are still here, and they've not gained any charm as they've aged. But I have to say, Brutal Legend isn't looking too hot either.
Stupid mother! Fucking piece of shit!
Next time, I'm concluding a trilogy.